One thing that's very clear and has been replicated in a number of studies over the past year and a half or so, and it's that during COVID-19, during the pandemic in particular, frequency of social media use has been directly linked to increased depression and increased anxiety or combination of depression and anxiety, and also other mental health conditions, but especially depression and depression combined with anxiety. Not just in young people, but also in adults. We're seeing it everywhere. Social media seems to be very toxic for people's mental health, especially during the pandemic. Why? I don't think we have a why answer yet. But some of the things we're talking about might give, clue us in as to what might be going on there.
3, 2, 1. Welcome to Love Machine.
Welcome to another Nerding Out with That Nerdy Catholic. My name is Seth Payne, That Nerdy Catholic, and we have on again this week Dr. Brent Robbins, who is a professor of psychology. Last week we had a wonderful, long discussion, but a great discussion about mercy, forgiveness, compassion, and especially what that means in our modern day, especially thinking about where we are with the cancel culture and this people rushing to judge and to find justice that has no mercy. But this week, actually maybe even in response to last week, we're going to be talking about emotional health and how to be emotionally healthy online. So we're going to jump into it now. Dr. Brent Robbins, thanks for joining us again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Seth. It's always fun.
Yeah. So this idea of thinking about what we were talking about mercy and the cancel culture, and we got into talking about polarization. Talk about how issues of polarization and especially how we see it happening on social media. How does that affect people emotionally? And are there any studies, or have there been any studies looking at how that impacts people emotionally and psychologically?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'll just say right out that off the bat that there's no research that I have seen looking at polarization in particular on social media and how that influences people's mental health. So there's not. It should be studied, and hopefully will be studied. But right now, it's not in the empirical literature. But I can speak from personal experience and just observation from what I see with other people. Is that the problem the problem with the political polarization that we're seeing right now is that there's no room for any middle ground, right, around issues, that people are so rigidly and ideologically possessed, you might say, whether it's on the right or on the left, that if anybody just deviates just a little bit, raises a question, wait a minute, why do we believe this? Why are we asserting this? Then they get sort of beaten up, by their peers, and it's not very safe to venture far from that group, your tribe, because the other group is trying to destroy you. So if you get isolated from your group, then you get attacked because then you become vulnerable. So I think there's a tribalism going on where people are clinging to their social groups, and there's a strong pressure to conform. And so where we can draw from here in terms of the empirical psychological literature is social psychology, because we know a lot about group dynamics. I mean, a century of research on that. And what we find is that there's this in-group, out-group kind of dynamic that happens. And then when you get this kind of polarization between groups, people tend to become even more conforming to their group, right, because they feel they're vulnerable to the out-group. And then you add something like the pandemic to that, and it's like, taking a match, and throwing it on a pile of kindling, just the whole thing goes up. And the reason for that is because something called death salience. So that basically when people think about risk or their life is being threatened in some way, it amplifies all of these effects. People tend to cling more closely to their group, and they tend to become more hostile to out groups. So I think we already had polarization, and then you add a pandemic on top of it, and people having to wear masks and worrying about their health and safety, and watching the news every night, hearing about how people are dying, reminds people of that threat to their lives, and all of that amplifies the polarization. So I think what happens when people are in those situations, when they become conforming, is I think that there's an interesting experiments that were done way back in the 1960s with a guy named Solomon Asch. Some of you are probably familiar with this, where they would take images of lines, and with different lines, and all the person had to say was which was the longest line. I think there would be like 4 lines, and it'd be obvious which line was the longest out of the 4. And then they would go through a panel, and ask each person which was the longest line. And so the first few runs, these are all actors, and there's only one participant, but the participant thinks everybody else is also a participant. And for the first few times, everybody gives the right answer. And then maybe the third or fourth trial, the actors give the wrong answer, the obviously wrong answer. And then by the time it gets to the participant, they have to make a decision whether to go by what they're seeing or to conform to the group. And there's video of this. I saw them on YouTube. It's so funny because you see the facial expressions on the participants where they're like, what's going on? That it's actually pretty humorous to watch the videos. But generally people react in 2 ways. Either they start to question their own judgment and doubt themselves, and then conform to the group, assuming they must be right because there's some consensus, or they don't concede internally, but they kind of contemptively, resentfully go along with the group because they don't want to cause waves, right? So that was a finding way back in the late 1960s, and I think we're seeing a lot of that. I think people are in some ways clinging to their groups, but feeling uncomfortable about that. I think that not always at one with themselves in the group, and feeling like they might have a position where they dissent with their group, but feeling afraid to even talk about it with their in-group because because the polarization is creating increased hostility, they're afraid of being rejected by their group. So I think what you're having is an old term, that goes back to existential psychology, is the experience of alienation, right? Feeling alienated, feeling like there's what I'm seeing in social media, what I'm hearing people say, and then there's reality, and there seems to be a disconnect between those things. I'm seeing a lot of that.
Yeah, and especially I feel like I've had a number of experiences where you're in a one-on-one conversation with someone, and you're saying, well, I don't understand why there's all this polarization. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with someone saying, well, yeah, all this polarization is exact, it's right.
Right. Nobody likes it, but everyone does.
Right.
Yeah.
But the one-on-one conversations, you're like, well, I don't understand all this polarization, and yet the polarization is there. But the thing is, when you're having a one-on-one conversation, you're with a person, you're looking at them, you're getting nuance, you're talking in nuance. But then when you go online, you don't have that interaction. You don't have the nuance, and so you have the bold statements that people are making,
right?
Online, right?
Right. And then sometimes, I think sometimes I felt this too. There's even maybe a pressure within your in-group to say something, right? Like this idea that if you don't say something, then you're with them. So you feel compelled to say something you don't even really believe sometimes because there's social pressure to do that. I felt the pressure. Yeah. I try to resist that, but I felt a pressure many times, pressure to do that for my own in-groups, increasingly within the past couple of years, whether it's saying you're vaccinated or saying you're not vaccinated or saying you should wear masks or saying you shouldn't wear masks or whatever, supporting police or supporting this person or that person. They're whether it's political or whether it's around, all of it's political in one form or another. So I think, but when you have this alienation that starts to happen, you develop what Carl Rogers called incongruency. There starts to be a disconnect between your outward behavior and your inward sense of things or your perception of things. And when you start to get that rift between those two, that creates neurosis. In fact, that's how Carl Rogers defined neurosis. All neurosis had to do with incongruity. Like, not being, he thought it was, if you had parents that didn't accept you for who you are, didn't really love you, but only loved you under certain conditions, then you start to develop an outward self that conforms to what your parents desire, but inwardly you don't adopt those because you feel like the parents don't really love you. They're just want you to be something to meet their own needs. So, and there's some evidence to support that. When people have those kind of relationships with parents, they're more, likely to have depression, anxiety, higher in the personality trait of neuroticism, which is a kind of emotional instability, and also the difficulty making decisions and orienting one's life toward goals becomes a problem too. There are problems of motivation, which are closely linked to depression and anxiety and other psychological conditions. So I think that's a danger. So I think in our social groups, because of alienation, we're seeing increased incongruence. People are less authentic, and because people are being less authentic, that makes them susceptible to neurosis, depression, anxiety, etc.
And it feels like it's a feedback loop, because if you then feel like you can't be authentic, then when you go online, you are portraying something that is not really you. And then other people see that, and then they say, oh, wait a second, I have to be like that, even though I'm not. That there's someone in my group, so I need to try and fit in with that, and then it almost feels like it's an avalanche, right? That you have people that are trying to put out their best idealized self that fits in with the group that they're in. And then other people see that, and then they try and go along with that. And so everyone seems to be in this state where we are, we're betraying ourselves, sometimes even knowingly.
Right.
And then you have this facade of everyone out there that doesn't really fit anyone.
Yeah. I mean, I think last week we talked about Rene Girard. I mean, he's relevant here because part of his social theory is this emphasis on mimesis, this mimetic desire, that the way we learn to desire is by adopting the desires of others, right? So there's what he calls mimetic contagion is precisely what you're describing. These moments when a kind of mob mentality emerges where there's a kind of, everyone's sort of trying to copy everybody else's desire, and it becomes amplified and out of control. He sees that as a phenomenon behind, for example, lynch mobs, that you see in history of America, or other forms of persecution where people come together as a mob and they do things that they would probably never do individually, but because of this mimetic contagion, suddenly they're doing. And I think that's what social media seems to facilitate, that kind of mimetic contagion. In addition to, another problem, of course, is envy, right? Because you see what other people do, and then you're like, oh, I want to go on a vacation like that, or why don't I have a house that looks like that? And people forget that, people don't post their miseries most of the time on social media. They only post the best side of themselves. So it's not good to compare yourself to other people online. I can assure you, having been a trained therapist and studying psychology, that everyone is suffering in their own way. It's like everybody has a cross to bear. And so, and also from a Christian perspective, we're called not to covet our neighbor's goods, right? And I think there's a good reason for that, because God knows our tendency to get caught up in this mimetic contagion.
Yeah. Well, God knows this so much
better than we do.
Than we know ourselves. Yeah.
Right.
Do you think that there is? People talk a lot about, especially the younger generation, that they're always on social media and that they don't have the in-person friendships that they should have. Do you think that plays a big part in this?
Yes, I think, it's interesting. I'll say a couple things about some empirical research on this. One thing that's very clear and has been replicated in a number of studies over the past year and a half or so. And it's that during COVID-19, during the pandemic in particular, frequency of social media use has been directly linked to increased depression increased anxiety or combination of depression and anxiety, and also other mental health conditions, but especially depression and depression combined with anxiety. Not just in young people, but also in adults. And so that I think is something that there's so much evidence for now, and it's so consistent across cultures. First study was done in China, but there's been studies done in the UK, United States, Australia, South America. So we're seeing it everywhere. The social media seems to be very toxic for people's mental health, especially during the pandemic. Why? I don't think we have a why answer yet. But some of the things we're talking about might give, clue us in as to what might be going on there. But when it comes to generally, when people have been doing research on social media, there's been somewhat mixed results. In other words, when people use social media, does it make them more susceptible to mental health problems? And the answer to that is the findings are not conclusive on that. There have been some studies that have shown that adolescents, and in some studies adults, seem that when they more frequently use social media, that it seems to be linked with various forms of psychopathology. There's been other studies that haven't found a link between those at all. And I think that the trick here is that it's the type of use that you're involved in. So there's been some new research that looks at when somebody does what they call routine use of social media. That means you go on, you see what's going on, you post something, you post a picture, and then you go on with your life, That doesn't seem to be particularly harmful. Or maybe you're doing, maybe you're using, I use social media a lot to share music with people or to talk with colleagues about an upcoming conference or something like that. I'm not like caught up in it emotionally, right? I'm using it as a tool. But when people are very caught up emotionally, they call it an emotional connection to social media. Like if you're finding that, and I think this is closely connected to some other research looking at addictive uses of social media and video games. It seems to have this kind of emotional connection. Then it usually has a compulsive quality, like you have a hard time going to sleep because you can't stop till you're losing sleep. You're not taking care of yourself. You're not exercising like you should. Maybe you're not eating right because you're spending too much time online. It's kind of taking over your life, and you're having a lot of them. And I would say a good clue is you're just too emotionally attached. That seems to be linked.
Too many Hot Pockets and Pop-Tarts and
yeah, so you can get back, Facebook or whatever,
quickly.
Or Instagram or whatever it is that you're doing. And there's a number of people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and some other similar conditions are especially susceptible to these addictions, especially young people. So I think there's some concern. When there was a study done in the United Kingdom where they interviewed 14-year-olds, and there was pretty much a consensus across the 14-year-olds that social media was problematic, that it was a danger to their mental health and mental health of their peers, that it could become addictive, and that it was a platform for cyberbullying. So cyberbullying seemed to be an important factor. Some studies, this is another one that's kind of inconsistent, maybe because it depends on where you are geographically. But in the UK, when the studies coming out of the United Kingdom seem to show that girls, especially young girls, are more susceptible to getting involved in cyberbullying and being negatively impacted by it, both being a victim and a perpetrator and suffering consequences, both on either side of that. It seems like British boys are less likely to get drawn into that. Whereas in America, there was just the opposite. It was in one study I found, at least there's one study, it needs to be replicated, but boys are more susceptible than the girls. So maybe there's a cultural thing here. I don't know. But I think that cyberbullying seems to be an issue, that when people get drawn into, this is where I think we talked about cancel culture last week. In a certain sense, there's an element of bullying to this, right? As a way of sort of ostracizing people, making them feel left out, isolating them. What's often referred to as social aggression can Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media platform you're using can be a platform for that. It can be a way to carry out that social aggression. And so that's sort of a summary of the research that I've seen. And then I think based on that, the other thing is issues around self-esteem, concerns about weight, issues about body image. This seems to be really exacerbated by social media. I think for a couple of different reasons. One is there's a really interesting body of research. I write about it in my book, The Medicalized Body in Anesthetic Culture. There's a chapter on objectification of women that think about pornography, right? In the way that the internet is, and really the culture in general is full of images that objectify women, reduce women to sort of objects of, a pleasurable gaze, and an object of abuse, right? To use that person, to view that person for your own pleasure without concern for that other person. That's how I would define that kind of abuse and what objectification is. And maybe that's another discussion we can have sometime about objectification. Yeah. But when you look at objectification, it seems to be when young girls and women are online, and there's this, again, maybe some pressure to present themselves in a way that shows skin or that, shows off their physical attributes. There may be some social pressure to do that, and that can be very debilitating on women's mental health. Well, even if they look fine, even if they're healthy and they don't have a problem with obesity or something like that, there is a strong tendency for women to become susceptible to the kind of things we see with eating disorders, where they have distorted perceptions of their own body, and social media can exacerbate that. So we see more social media use, by the way, is associated with bulimia nervosa, increase in bulimia nervosa for that reason. And there's the other side. The other issue I want to mention, though, is that just also, if you're on social media all the time, you may also feel bad about your body because you may be unhealthy, and you may not feel good about how you look because you may need to be thinking about doing more exercise and caring for yourself. And maybe physically, if you're not happy with the way you look, it could be because you're distorting. It could be maybe you're not happy with the way you look because you're out of shape, and you should be. And that could be a warning sign that you should, back off social media and focus more on taking care of your health.
On an encouraging note, there are a few people that are large on YouTube, have a very large following, and have in the past, I would say 6 months, maybe a year, have become more honest about struggles that they're having. There's one guy, Philip DeFranco, who has a daily show, and he's been really honest about issues that he's had with health, both physical and mental health, and how he's trying to take care of himself and really pleading for people to take care of themselves. So I think that it's starting to become more of a public issue that people are talking about and saying, it's not all real. All this stuff you see, and the thing about what you were saying about objectification, it's the same thing. They're seeing images that just aren't real and thinking, well, I have to measure up to that. Right.
I mean, you literally have, photoshopped images, where people have like bodies in magazines and, on social media advertising, where they literally have bodies that can't possibly exist physiologically. Yes. And it's ridiculous for anyone to try to compare. But that's for men and women. It's like you see these, monstrous people. Usually they get there because they're, usually taking some kind of drug, to buff themselves up like that too. So some guys, that's true. I want to mention that too, that men are less likely to complain about this, but we know based on more implicit measures that men are also susceptible to these issues around body image. It's just a little bit different. Women tend to be self-conscious about being too big, right? Or overweight. And men are self-conscious about not being muscular enough, not being big enough. Yeah. And so men have body image issues too. I think that we neglect. Part of the problem is the measures that we use were designed on women's body image, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
translate well to men, because men will say, no, they're not worried about being fat. They're just worried about being too thin.
Right. How do we then approach this? I mean, I know we can't solve the whole problem of social media, but just thinking about what are some things that you can do, especially if you are finding that you are feeling, either depressed or anxious,
Right.
because of your activity on Facebook, because of what you're seeing, whether you don't feel like you measure up, or whatever the issue is.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I think it's a good idea to think about moderating social media use.
Mm-hmm.
And I would suggest, based on the studies I've seen, that you start to see the susceptibility to a kind of addictive compulsive behaviors when people are on more than 2 hours a day, 2 to 5 hours a day. That might be a sign, unless you're doing it for work or something like that, that maybe it's a bit too much, and maybe try to keep it to 1 or 2 hours. The other thing is, but everybody's a little bit different, so I think that you have to figure out what for you means moderating your use. So I think one of the things to look at is if you have that emotional connection, if it feels compulsive, if it feels like you can't take a break. And if you're not sure, I would say try to turn it off for a week. Take a social media vacation. I've done this a couple times recently, and it was really interesting because I felt like, just like you have withdrawal when you have an addiction, like, not because I check into Facebook in particular, like all the time. And I found when I took a vacation, I was like, I kind of had some withdrawals. Like I wanted to check in. But then by the end of the week, I was like, who cares about Facebook? It was like, I didn't even feel any need to go back. So it was a nice kind of withdrawing from a kind of addictive, kind of compulsive behavior. And it's not that's not your fault, by the way. Don't feel ashamed if you feel like there's something compulsive or addicting about social media, because there are people who are being paid a lot of money who work for Facebook and who work for Twitter who want you to become addicted, because then you stay online longer, and
that's how they make their money.
They make more advertising dollars. So it's part of the game to get people addicted. And it's for some people that might mean maybe that's so repulsive you don't want to be part of that world anymore. And I would completely understand that. But if you feel like, but in the other way, it's hard these days because social media is so much a part of our social world to just check out entirely. Moderating is probably a more reasonable. And if you can, and then take a vacation, and that will give you some perspective on how addicted you are. How hard that is for you to do would give you help you diagnose yourself, assess yourself about how attached you are. If you have that emotional addiction, then you might ask yourself, one thing I would ask yourself, I suggest you ask is this social media addressing some fundamental need? Am I trying to use social media, I should say, to address some fundamental need I have that social media really can't address? One is loneliness. We know based on research that social media, even though we're interacting with people, it doesn't fill the same need as getting together with people in person, interestingly enough. We don't really understand why. We just know in the research that interacting with people on social media and interacting with a person in person is not equivalent in terms of our emotional needs. So make sure you're getting together with family, friends, people who uplift you, and you're spending time with people. That's a fundamental human need that we have.
Yeah. Just speaking from my own experience, like we were talking about before, when I interact with someone in person, there's nuance.
Right.
And I can see their perfections and their flaws, and especially if you have a close friend, or I think even more so a family member. There's someone in your family, you can't hide anything from them. They can't hide anything from you. You know all of their flaws. And so the complexity of the relationship is so much greater. Where if you're online, if you're on Facebook or Twitter, as we said before, you're just seeing what they want you to see.
Right. Yeah. And so you don't really get a good sense. It's a distorted picture of other people. Yeah. The other thing I would say is that there seems to be a connection between especially compulsive use of social media and lack of sleep. And when people start missing sleep, that is very deleterious to mental health and to
Mm.
physical health. And it's so I would say trying to keep in mind, trying to make a commitment to getting 7 or 8 hours of sleep per night, I think is a really good
Mm-hmm.
decision to do for your health. I feel a little bit of a hypocrite here because I'm not always very good at doing that. Part of a life of being an academic is, doing work all the time and trying to get things published and stuff like that. But I think over the years, in more recent years, I've really become more mindful about self-care. I was just talking to one of my colleagues today about that and how
Mm-hmm.
we're really trying to carve out time for ourselves and making sure we're getting enough sleep, making sure we're eating well and not just grabbing fast food or, crappy prepared food, like TV dinners or something like that, and trying to make a nice, healthy, well-rounded meal, without a lot of
Mm-hmm.
refined carbohydrates and all those problematic preservatives. And at the same time, taking time for exercise, taking walks, going to the gym, making that a commitment, part of all those things are not just helpful for your physical health. Of course they are
Mm-hmm.
good for your physical health, but they're also helpful for your mental health. In fact, you almost will never hear, you certainly will not hear a pharmaceutical company advertise this because there's no money to be made from it. But it's a fact that the best treatment for depression in terms of the quickness of the results of the intervention, the cost effectiveness of it, and the robust impact that it has on depression is aerobic activity.
Mm-hmm.
People who do aerobic activity 3 or more times a day have lower rates of depression, and when they are depressed, they rapidly diminish their depression even more than if they're taking medication or psychotherapy, which is kind of amazing.
Well, and I have to send a shout out to my wife because she is so good at noticing when I get home from work and I look like I'm worn out and haven't had a great day. She'll look at me. She's like, "So, have you had any exercise today?" I'll say, "No." But she's like, "All right, go. Why don't you go out, walk around the block?" I'm like, okay. I'll go out, I'll walk or I'll jog, and even for just a few minutes, I'll come back and be like, "Oh, thank you, I needed that."
Yeah, that's great. It really does that. Yeah, I mean, I do an elliptical. I really started when this pandemic happened. I really made a commitment because we were as a family we were going to the gym, but then that became
Mm-hmm.
unavailable.
Yeah.
So I have this elliptical at home, and I just do it as often as I can, every day if I can. But sometimes I can't
Mm-hmm.
do it every day. I would say minimum 3 or 4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such when I get it's funny because I always feel it's like confession. Catholics will probably relate to this. Like I always feel this like I don't want to go to confession. Like you don't want to go, and
Mm-hmm.
then when you're done with it, you feel like you're floating on air.
Yeah.
That feeling
Yeah.
of going to confession.
Yeah.
It's like exercise, the same thing. Like you dread doing it, and then when you
I
do it,
don't
you're
want to
like,
do it.
why did I dread that? I feel awesome.
Why do I ever feel like I don't want to do this? I should do it all the time, and then the next day comes like, oh, I don't want to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I really think exercise is very important. The other thing is just I want to strongly emphasize the spiritual dimension of this as well because I think making sure that social media isn't encroaching on your prayer life. And if you're not a theist,
Mm-hmm.
if you're watching this and you don't believe in God, there's mindfulness meditation can approximate some of the psychological benefits of prayer,
Mm-hmm.
and who knows, maybe if you're skeptical and you don't believe in God, maybe that'll create a space where you might discover God in your life if you leave a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of space for it. If you're open to that. But I would say that
Mm-hmm.
there's some good research that when people have a spiritual life, when they're engaged in prayer, when they're provide a space of silence, a contemplative space, that builds a lot of resiliency. And I think when that starts to get pushed out in favor of social media, that's also a danger.
I think this is a good conversation, and there are definitely a couple of things that we touched upon that would be good to come back and kind of dig deeper into at a later date. But Brent, I wanted to thank you for joining me again today.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's always a joy.
Yeah, I really enjoy our conversations. Really delving deep into some of these topics. But Thank you. And thank you for joining us again on this episode of Nerding Out. And if you are dealing with any of these issues, find someone to reach out to, especially in person. Find some friends or family that you can talk to. If you need help, find a counselor to go see or talk to. Find a priest to go talk to. But just do something to even make a little change and try to get some help. I hope you got something out of this conversation. I know I definitely did. And we'll talk to you and see you again next week. All right, bye.
System shut down.